Hello and welcome to this very special episode of Wide Angle. Today we're interviewing the Swedish journalist and author Bertil Lintner, who's written his 18th book now on the Asia-Pacific region. He's written on everything from politics, organized crime, the refugee crisis, and in this latest book, China's India War, Bertil Lintner is challenging decades-old foreign policy analysis that has argued consistently that it was Jawaharlal Nehru's policy that provoked the 1962 China-India War. Mr. Lintner, I think the first question to you is, it's been conventional wisdom in foreign policy that it was Jawaharlal Nehru's forward policy towards Tibet in China in the northeast that ultimately provoked the Chinese incursions and the war in 1962. What has prompted you to challenge this wisdom today? Why did you feel the need to write this book?
Basically because I saw that it was wrong and it was historically incorrect. But there's no way that Nehru's forward policy could have provoked this war, because that policy was announced in November 1961 at the meeting here in New Delhi, and the war broke out in October 62. So are we to believe that in less than a year the Chinese will be able to mobilize tens of thousands of troops and move them through the most difficult terrain in the world at that time, heavy military equipment, the detailed intelligence about the areas which they attacked and later captured? And when Brigadier John Delvey arrived at his prisoner of war camp after being captured by the Chinese, he came to this tent city where they had enough room for 1,000 POWs, and they even brought in interpreters who spoke a variety of Indian languages. Before the war, the Chinese had also contacted the Naga rebels from India's northeast and promised them aid.
Right.
So obviously, this is nothing you can do in a space of 11 months. This takes years of preparations. And my conclusion is that the decision to teach India a lesson, which is the exact quote from Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, that decision was taken in 1959.
In 1959, that was when the Dalai Lama had fled Tibet and come to India as well.
Yes.
So I think there are many in India who are welcoming the book for the fact that it's clarifying and also defending, in a sense, what India has argued as far as the 1962 war is concerned. But to also sort of place your book in context of what's going on, I think first I'd like you to talk about the geopolitical, the geostrategic global context of India and China at the time of the war. And the second is the fact that the book has come out today when there are Sino-Indian tensions in different spheres, from the waters to land to the economies of both countries to regional influence. You're seeing a lot of that play out even today.
Sure. And because it's being played out today, I think it's very important to get the history right and not to have a distorted view of what happened in 1962, before, during and after the 1962 war. But you must remember that at the time that this war was fought in 1962, China was an extremely closed country. The outside world did not know what was happening inside China at that time. And few, if any, were aware of the fact that China had just gone through one of its worst famines in history. In the late 1950s, Mao Zedong launched what he called the Great Leap Forward. He's going to modernize China, industrialize China, and turn it into a modern industrialized nation. That turned out to be a complete disaster. Between 30 to 40 million people died from starvation, disease. There was cannibalism. Mao Zedong's position in the Communist Party, which is the most important organ of power in China, was very shaky. He was almost on his way out because he was blamed for this disaster. In a situation like that, well, it's not really surprising that Mao Zedong and some people around him decided to divert their attention from the problems at home and then look at an outside enemy, a convenient outside enemy, and then unite against which the party, the government and the military could unite. And India became that very convenient outside enemy. And that was, of course, because first of all, it was easy to point to the fact that the Dalai Lama had been given refuge here sanctuary in 1959. But there were also other considerations. I mean, throughout the 1950s, there was India. There was the leading voice for the newly independent countries, the developing countries of Asia and
the non-aligned movement.
The non-aligned movement in Africa. Not China, but Tranchil, what language is that? And there was India that actually brought you allied to the Bandung Conference in 1955. So, but India's idea of non-alignment was being challenged by Mao Zedong's theory of the three worlds.
Right.
And Mao Zedong's three-world theory differs from the Western concept. In the West, we have thought about the Eastern Bloc, the Western Bloc, and the rest of the world. Mao Zedong, he saw the first world, because he threw the superpowers. There was the United States and the Soviet Union. Two lesser powers, and three, the developing world. Mao Zedong wanted China to be the leader of the third world, and especially the revolutionary forces in the third world. And in order to achieve that, he would have to dethrone India from its moral high ground, from the leader of
this bloc,
or their blocks, which they wanted leadership of naturally. So the best, in order to do that, they had to humiliate India, and that's actually what was achieved by the 1962 war. It had very little to do with the actual border.
Right.
If you look at it historically, in the early 1950s, the Chinese didn't talk about the border that much. Of course, after the invasion of Tibet, it was important to secure the control over Tibet. But the Chinese didn't even know where the border was at that time. They had no maps. And it was only around 1959 again that the Chinese suddenly started talking about the border. How important it was to get the Indians out of South Tibet. The term wasn't used at that time, but that's what they meant. What in India was the Northeast Frontier Agency. So if you put all these arguments together, you can see that there was much more to the war than Nehru's forward policy. And if you talk about forward policies, what India did at that time wasn't really that aggressive. They were just fortifying positions along the border.
Right.
But still, they were not strong enough to defend those positions when the Chinese attacked. And that was the main problem at that time. India was ill-equipped to defend its forward policy.
So,
whereas China had a very aggressive forward policy. They invaded Tibet.
Right. So very clearly, as you said, it's important not to distort history, and what we've studied all these years has been a different perspective, the Chinese perspective perhaps, that has dominated the discourse on the 62 war globally, not within India, but certainly how the outside world has understood this conflict. But let me come to another point that you've made just now. You talked about Mao Zedong, and many people, many China watchers say after Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, now it's Xi Jinping who's like the third leader of China, and he's being given that place, not posthumously, but while he's very much in office. And the last Communist Party Congress that met in October consolidated his position, almost in a sense making him possibly one of the single biggest leaders in the world. Is that something you see as well? Do you see his role like that?
Well, absolutely. Globally? I mean, Mao Zedong tried to modernize China, and he did succeed to some extent. I mean, China, when he died in 1976, was very different from when he seized power in 1949. But it was still not a major power, world power. And they supported revolutionary movements all over the world, including here in India, the Nagas, the Misos, the Manipuris. They wanted to support the Naxalites, but they turned out to be too troublesome. Deng Xiaoping modernized China, turned it into an industrialized nation. Xi Jinping, he wants to turn China into world power, if not the world power, because you can see how America's influence is on the decline. Well, America's on the decline as a world power, China is rising. And Xi Jinping is probably emerging as the most powerful man in the world today.
What does that mean for India? Because there's also this sort of tussle for regional influence that's taking place in the larger East Asian and South Asian region that we can see. It plays out, whether it's One Belt, One Road, whether it is what's happening in the South China Seas, or Djibouti, for example, the new ports that the Chinese are setting up. We're seeing this play out in different spheres on the economic front, really, also.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's going to be another war in the Himalayas. That's extremely unlikely. The border issue will remain an issue for many years to come because it gives the Chinese some kind of leverage in negotiations with India. I don't think China is really interested in settling that border. Because how can they do it? What could India and China possibly agree on? But where India's and China's interests are colliding, I'm not talking about an armed conflict here. I'm talking about a conflict of, interests colliding.
Influence.
Influence and interest is in the Indian Ocean. China has launched this extremely ambitious, One Belt, One Road initiative, where they're going to develop the infrastructure of half the world, really. And they're talking about reviving old trade routes, ancient trade routes, the Silk Road and so on. Yes, there was a overland Silk route from Europe and the Middle East to China. But a maritime Silk route? No, that never existed. In fact, the Chinese had never been in the Indian Ocean since Zheng He, who was a Muslim navigator for the emperor, who sailed across the Indian Ocean in the 15th century, so 600 years ago. And he did sail with a big fleet of merchant ships and warships and so on to India, to Southeast Asia, and to the east coast of Africa. But after that, China showed no interest in the oceans or any kind of maritime activity at all. Traders made it to China, sure, but those were foreigners. And even after the fall of the empire in 1911, 1912, and China tried to become a modern nation, a modern democratic republic, they did not develop any navy. What all they had at that time was sort of patrol boats in the rivers to suppress piracy, banditry, and insurrections.
Right.
It is only now that China is developing a blue water navy. And of course, that is easy to understand why they're doing that. Because most of their trade is through the Indian Ocean. They get most of the oil supplies from the Middle East. They get minerals from Africa. And the exports to Africa and to Europe go through the Indian Ocean. So with that comes, of course, a desire or a need, I would say, to establish some kind of political influence over the region. And with political influence comes military might as well, because you need the military to protect your political influence. And then, of course, the other powers in the Indian Ocean region are getting worried about this because they don't really know what China is up to, what it's going to lead to. And we have a number of countries there, not only India, we have America, the United States, the most important overseas military base is in Diego Garcia. Not that far from Djibouti, where the Chinese have established their first overseas military base.
That's right.
You have France in the southern Indian Ocean, and you have Australia controlling islands there, the Cocos Keeling Islands and the Christmas Island. So you can see this kind of informal alliance emerging here, not necessarily against China, but at least to watch China. What is China really up to here?
The Quadrilateral that you're referring to as well, in a sense.
Yes, sure.
So it's interesting that you say that there won't be another conflict in the Himalayas because while the Chinese are using it as leverage. But I think the follow-up question I'd like to ask you on that is, why do you say that? Because at the end of the day, the maritime domain, India has a much stronger presence, whether it's in the nature of having a better equipped navy, whether it is the alliances that you mentioned. Why would China try and do that?
Because the Indian Ocean is so economically, politically, strategically important to China. And yes, India is much stronger now, but China is increasing its presence in the Indian Ocean. Chinese submarines have been spotted there for more than 10 years. There have been port visits in Myanmar and in Pakistan and so on. And China is even targeting very small and I would say vulnerable island nations in the Indian Ocean, like the Maldives, the Seychelles, expanding their cooperation with those, promising aid and loans and that sort of thing. And even they offer them military assistance and some kind of exchange of military.
So in its attempt to take on India in its own region and in its own domain, China has also, apart from Djibouti and apart from the African coast or Southeast Asia, within the South Asian region as well, China's relationship with Pakistan, all-weather friendship that they have, that's one. The investments in Myanmar or Bangladesh or Nepal or Sri Lanka. Out of all of these, which country do you think China will possibly focus on the most if it wants to leverage that influence in India's immediate neighborhood?
Well, the country they've been focusing a lot over the past 20, 25 years is Myanmar. Because Myanmar is China's corridor to the Indian Ocean. But you remember that if you look at the map, that China is actually a huge inland empire with a comparatively short coastline for such a huge country. And China's economy is export-driven. They need ports. And China's ports are not enough. China's own ports are not enough to export some of the goods produced in the landlocked western provinces of the country. So therefore they're looking for outlets to the sea through other countries. The first was, of course, the Karakoram highway to Pakistan. But then we're really out in Xinjiang in the far, west of the country. But China started to look at Myanmar as an outlet for export back in the mid-1980s. And gradually they have developed the kind of relations with Myanmar. They have also built pipelines to carry oil and gas through Myanmar to China to bypass the choke points at the Malacca Strait. So I would say that Myanmar is strategically the most important country here for China.
You talk about Myanmar, and I know you've done a lot of writing on Myanmar as well, and as of course the entire region. Myanmar is an interesting country for India in the neighborhood as well. One, obviously, because you say it's China's route to the waters, but the second is that even of late, with what's going on with the refugee crisis, India's position on Myanmar has always been a little conflicted, possibly. Aung San Suu Kyi was given the Gandhi Peace Prize when she was under house arrest. That was a message to the regime about the fact that they didn't really they believed in democratic values. On the other hand, India opened up engagement with the military regime and the junta way back in the early 90s with the Tamu-Kalimeo Road in the northeast. Economic partnership was seen as important. Now you see the rise of a different kind of sentiment on Myanmar, where, when the Rohingya refugee crisis is something that's causing tremendous concern globally, statements from political leaders in India are seen as hugely problematic, and they're backing up the Myanmar government right now, including Aung San Suu Kyi, on those statements. Is this being seen globally as a kind of is it being seen as something that India needs to do for its strategic autonomy that it talks about, or is there disappointment with India's position on the refugees globally?
Well, there may be disappointment internationally, but I can assure that there's no disappointment inside Myanmar at all. They welcome that approach. I mean, how awful it may seem to us. Because the Rohingya crisis is not just another ethnic problem that Burma is facing. The way people in Myanmar see it, I'm not saying that it's my opinion, but the way they see it is that the Rohingyas are not just any Muslim minority in the country. There are many Muslims in Myanmar. In every city you have Muslim communities. You have, Rangoon, Mandalay, everywhere. They are Myanmar citizens, they have Burmese names, they speak Burmese. The Rohingyas are a rural community who speak the Chittagonian dialect of Bengali. And most people in Burma, rightly or wrongly, see them as interlopers for Bangladesh. And for that reason, there's no support inside the country for the Rohingya cause, so to speak. So I don't think India's standpoint there has, in any fact, had any impact on the standing of India in the Myanmar public opinion. But this goes back to what I'm writing about the book, what I call the Myanmar corridor. It is of vital importance to China. China saw its influence in Myanmar decline in 2011, 2012. And the reason why Myanmar decided to become more democratic, so to speak, was not because the generals had a democratic awakening experience one morning and decided that, look, we have to be more, nicer guys here, right?
Right.
I've seen classified, top-secret documents from the Myanmar military outlining a strategy. And the reason why these documents were compiled is because, as it says in those documents, we are becoming a colony of China. Our sovereignty, our independence is in danger. We have to improve relations with the West, in order to lessen our dependence on China. This is the way to do it. And this is exactly what they've done. So now, because of the Rohingya crisis, the West policy has changed again. Because after Myanmar opened up to the West, Myanmar was turned from being an international pariah into becoming the darling of the West. Hillary Clinton went there, Barack Obama went there, Prime Minister Cameron went there, everyone went there and promised aid and said this is a successful example of democratization. It was never a democratization that took place there. There was just another type of military rule, where the military remained all the organs of power with a civilian facade. And now, after the Rohingya crisis, all the refugees fleeing to Bangladesh, the West is again condemning Myanmar for human rights abuses. There have been talks about reimposing sanctions and so on. So China, this was a golden opportunity for China to come back. And now they're back in a big way.
So in a sense, it's a tough situation for a country like India to negotiate on the policy front as well, because while your larger regional geopolitics is governed by vying for influence or containing China's influential spread in the region, on the other hand, you have this situation with the Rohingya that might challenge that very politics and the policies.
You would say that. Well, the country has really benefited from the Rohingya crisis. That's China. I mean, the commander-in-chief, General Min Aung Hlaing, went to Beijing shortly when the West started condemning the behavior of his troops in Rakhine State. Aung San Suu Kyi went to Beijing afterwards, and China has promised Myanmar full support in the United Nations to block any kind of damaging resolutions by the Security Council and so on. So the winner here is China, and the West doesn't seem to realize that. And also the situation in the country, the refugee crisis, is far more complicated, far more complex than what you can see in this very simplistic description of the crisis in the Western media.
So how does India deal with this current situation? And as a follow-up to that, in the arc of Sino-Indian tensions that we've seen over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st century, where do you place this latest crisis?
Well, India's reaction to the Rohingya crisis and so on hasn't been that different from China's. But on the other hand, China has been much more proactive, whereas India sort of stayed back and done very little. So I think that's a difference. So China has benefited even from India's inaction on this in this issue. But we must look beyond the Rohingya crisis. We have other things which are equally important, or much more important, really. Cross-border trade, how to develop that.
Correct.
I mean, I just come back from Manipur and I come back from Moreh on the border, but the infrastructure has to be improved considerably if India really wants to trade with Myanmar. The other problems there, bureaucracy, red tape, checkpoints, and taxation by a number of underground groups. And most of the traders, I was there with a group of journalists from Myanmar, and most of the local traders we talked to complained about this. On the Chinese border, anything goes. You got an 8-lane highway right to the border. You got trucks lining up every morning carrying consumer goods to Myanmar and beyond. I mean, in Manipur, in the state capital, Imphal, there's a market which everyone calls the Burma market. But nothing there comes from Burma. It comes through Burma from China. And there is very little red tape, a very few checkpoints and so on. There's some revolutionary groups, but don't really collect tax on the cross-border trade. So India has a long way to go before it can even compete with China when it comes to trade with Myanmar.
And as far as sort of the One Belt, One Road land route, the maritime Silk Route, the overland Silk Route that they're talking about building up and developing, India has been extremely skeptical of that, partly because with the Sri Lanka experience, one has seen the kind of debt traps it's creating, certainly within the neighborhood. The China-Pakistan economic corridor is something that is of huge geopolitical and strategic concern to India. How do you think India should play its cards right now?
Well, it's not for me to be an advisor to the Indian government.
No, but from your experience.
What I can say is that, well, this One Belt, One Road thing is a fairly recent thing. It hasn't been out there for that long. But it's already running into trouble. It may not turn out the way the Chinese had expected it to do. First of all, Pakistan is an extremely unstable country. It's a lot of turmoil, internal turmoil. that trade corridor may not become this massive trade route that the Chinese had expected. And I think the Chinese are getting frustrated as well. It was only a few days ago some Chinese officials were complaining about corruption in Pakistan. I mean, are they really serious? Or was it something else they were worried about there, right? The port of Gwadar, I mean, it's still trouble about the ownership and how much China should have and how much Pakistan should have. Then you have Myanmar. The Rohingya crisis and the flight of the refugees is not that close to the gas and pipelines that China has built, but it's in the same state, the Rakhine state. And if the unrest spreads from the northern corner of Rakhine state to further to the south, those pipelines are not that secure anymore. And I think China is actually getting worried about the Myanmar corridor as well. That's why they now started to talk about a third alternative, the Kra Canal, to build a canal across the Isthmus of Kra in southern Thailand. Then they would bypass the Straits of Malacca, but they would even bypass Singapore. And I don't think Singapore would be very pleased to hear that. But this is, so you can see that it's not really working out that well, this over policy. It's running into one problem after another.
As a final question to you, Mr. Lintner, it's taken, as you said, you wanted to correct history as it's being told, and it's been told all these years. China's India war is correcting some of the conventional theories that one has had. It's taken a Swede to come and tell this story. So I think as the last question that I want to ask you is, why did you decide to focus all your career really in this part of the world? What interested you about East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia? And you ended up, you live in Chiang Mai. What about this part of the world?
Well, I was born in Sweden, that's correct. But I left Sweden when I was 22 years old in 1975, and I traveled overland to Asia and through Asia down to Australia and New Zealand. And as a young man traveling in this region, I felt that this is the place on the planet where I want to live. And there were a lot of young people traveling in Asia in those days. They were usually called hippies. And I wasn't a hippie, even if I traveled like one. I bought books everywhere. I read a lot. And all those books I still keep. I kept them at home in my bookshelf. And it was about history and culture and religion and so on. I was fascinated as a young man by the diversity of Asia. And eventually I decided in December 1979 to settle in Chiang Mai in northern Thailand and become a journalist and a writer. In the beginning it was very tough, of course, but I think now I am exactly that, a journalist and a writer.
So you might be a Swede telling the India story, but you're really a man of this part of the world now.
Yes, honestly, if I go to Sweden, I feel like a foreigner these days. I feel out of place.
Well, Bertil Lintner, we can only hope that you continue telling stories in this part of the world, for this part of the world as well, because I think the more there is in terms of writing and literature, the more awareness there is. It's always good to have history told in the current context and with the facts that you have placed before us today in this book. Thanks very much for joining us on Wide Angle.
Thank you.